Alright guys, we don't have all day. It is currently 7:30 and I'm drinking coffee. This is gonna be a long night. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be talking about what my favorite podcasts are. I pretty much use podcasts for all of my educational media consumption. That is where I keep up to date with current events, learn about politics, learn about what's going on in the world. That is my number one method. Being super knowledgeable and up to date about what's going on in the world is one of the quickest ways to sound really smart in work, with your friends, whatever. I highly recommend listening to podcasts. It will make you smarter because you'll know more about the world. You'll have taken in more opinions and you'll be able to create more informed opinions of your own. So without further ado, let's talk about the podcast that I listen to every day to shape my understanding of the world. So the first one on the list is already so famous, I feel like most of you will already know what it is, but the All In podcast. That is for successful venture capitalists with very different perspectives. Their perspectives differ on investment strategies, on their backgrounds. One is a lawyer and went to law school, one got their PhD, one worked in media and journalism, some were involved in big tech, some weren't. And they have very different political philosophies. If you know me personally, I've probably told you about this podcast. Comment below if you end up watching. Next on the list, we have Up First. Up First is the classic news podcast, comes out every day. It's by NPR. It's good, it does what it needs to do, it basically just tells you the news. I like that it's short. It's pretty much like a checkbox that I hit every day to just download the news. The cons are it's a little boring. I sometimes find that I zoned out and didn't listen to the whole thing, and then I listened to it again, but it's only 15 minutes long, so it's fine if I have to listen to it again. But I generally feel like podcasts are a great way to stay up to date with the news, so I highly recommend. You can just do it so easily while you're making your coffee or making your breakfast. Next up, we have the Financial Times news briefing. This one's just more news. It has some overlap with Up First, but usually it has a little bit of new material. I also find that listening to the two back-to-back really drills the current events into my head if I didn't get it the first time. This one's also every day. It's basically the same thing. Next, we have This Week in Startups. This podcast is actually hosted by one of the venture capitalists from the All In pod. His name's Jason Calacanis. He's actually the person who had the idea for the All In pod. He hosts this daily show about startups, and I learn a lot from it. The frequency of this is every day. I think it's moving to 4 times a week. Unfortunately. Pros, it's a really easy and great way to stay up to date with what's happening in the startup world, what the new technologies are, and hear cool founder and successful VC stories. The cons are sometimes Jason fails to consider alternative points and is really adamant about his position. In these moments, I get kind of annoyed. But one other complaint I have while I sit here on my soapbox is Jason brought on a woman co-host. Her name's Molly Wood, and she was great. She's super qualified from the New York Times. But the problem was I always felt like Jason overpowered her a bit. And I think it was because of the dynamic. She had just gotten into venture capital, and so it was a little bit of a mentor-mentee relationship, but they were co-hosts. It didn't feel like they were always on equal footing. That frustrated me slightly because I wanted more perspectives that I related to be voiced, but it's okay. I know it's hard. Generally, I'm not a hater. I love this podcast and I listen to it pretty much every day. And I also think that Jason's a great moderator. I have learned firsthand from making these videos how hard it is to record and not sound like an idiot. So, next up we have the Lex Friedman podcast. Lex is an MIT professor or ex-MIT professor or researcher. I don't know what his background is, to be honest. Something MIT related. And he interviews a bunch of subject matter experts Honestly, he gets like the best guests on his show. And he does these like really long, in-depth podcasts where he's asking the expert a million questions. And it's really interesting and I learn a ton. The thing is, I find Lex to be slightly monotone and sometimes I feel like he goes on tangents. So I actually don't listen to this podcast super consistently, but my boyfriend does. So he'll often tell me if an episode is particularly good and then I'll go listen to it. And honestly, people love his podcast, so don't take my word for it. Go listen to it and maybe you'll love it. Okay, number 6 on the list is Economics Explained. Economics Explained is this Australian guy who goes super in depth on various economic concepts and he teaches them in the most interesting ways, and he has a really fun to listen to voice. I honestly really recommend this podcast. Every time I listen to one of them, I just feel like I come out a million times smarter on the other end. He just makes it so clear and memorable. The last podcast I have on my list is Wisdom from the Top with Guy Raz. This podcast I've been listening to for so long. I feel like it's a classic. The premise of this podcast is telling CEOs' life stories, you know, how they were successful, how they rose within companies or founded their companies. I like to listen to it because it reminds you that CEOs are normal people just like you. The con with this one is sometimes it makes me feel inadequate or like I have to go work really hard, but that's okay. Maybe that's a good thing. Those are the podcasts I listen to and I highly recommend checking them out, and if you do, comment below and we can talk about them. Thanks so much for watching and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!